synths. So let's have a little play. So all the synth work you're hearing here is all being triggered via the brand new MIDIGriD plugin, which, as I said, I've had a ball with. I mean, I've had a ball with all the ADSR plugins, Hexel in particular. I absolutely love Drum Machine as well, but this really, I've really taken to it like a duck to water. It's so instant, it's unbelievable. So it's so simple to kind of get into. So what we'll do is, again, we've got this kind of progressive house kind of vibe going on. What we'll do, first of all, is we'll break down how the plugin works. So for those of you who may have used other ADSR plugins like Hexel, for example, this doesn't look too dissimilar in terms of the logic of actually how the plugin works. However, the layout is a little bit different. You'd be forgiven for thinking, why has Paul got a version of like an Ableton Push or like a Novation Launchpad like on his screen here? And it really is a very powerful grid system. So again, if you think about it, it's like a square hexel, really, in a way, which gives you the ability to do some really interesting, quite innovative, abilities to compose stuff very quickly. Cards on the table, I actually did this in about 30 seconds flat. This is a preset that I've made for myself, and I'm going to actually rebuild it from scratch to show you exactly how this works, because effectively you can place starting points on any point on the grid. And what you may also notice is that in the circular sections here, we've actually got different notes. So we've got D3, C3, A sharp 2, A2, G2, etc., blah, 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 blah. And for those of you who are of a music theory disposition, shall we say, we've actually got the D minor scale, because you can set the scale here. So the whole grid is essentially in forms of D minor, and the ability for you to actually be able to play around with that. So again, you've got D2 running down to D1. So it basically goes from D3 and then down to D1. So it's very, very clever in how this works. So to give you an idea of how it works, what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually just clear the thing off completely. You can also hit this reset button here. And one of the things we can do to start off with is just very simply just place something on a trigger, shall we say, on one of the points here. So we can actually just play that from there. And if we play that in isolation, and what you can see is I've got Monarch on the screen here for Native Instruments, which is one of my favorite bass synths. Really, really lovely plugin. And MIDIGriD is routed to trigger and play Monarch. So the way that we do that is in the I/O section here. So what we can do is in a group, as you can see here, if I just shuffle MIDIGriD to one side here, you can see MIDIGriD here on a MIDI channel, and then on another MIDI channel, we have the reactor carrying Monarch. We'll then set the MIDI from to the correct channel, in this case, channel 5. You can see I've got 3 different instances of MIDIGriD running, one for each of the instruments that we're working with. And then from there, we would, rather than select pre or post effects, we'll go to MIDIGriD. So from there, we have to set the monitor to in, and then we are, shall we say, off to the races. So from here, what we can do is isolate. We can just listen to that in solo, and you'll see how MIDIGriD works. So the grid is currently set in terms of note length and speed to 16th notes. So that means each one of these grid slots is equating to traveling at a 16th note. And obviously it'll play at the project tempo. So if we play that, you'll see exactly what I mean. Now what you'll notice here straight away, even if I just put the click in, I mean, that could be interesting enough right there, you know, when you put it next to a kick, for example. So, you know, I could actually, you know, solo the kick in my channel here. Like, I'm into it already. I could probably sit there and listen to that for an extended period of time, right? So quite interesting from the off, because what you'll notice is that once the trigger, shall we say, travels to the extreme right or the extreme left side of the grid, or indeed from the bottom to the top, you actually will get a note trigger. So basically these elements move, as you can see, from left to right, and once it hits a barrier, shall we say, it moves in the opposite direction. So things start to get really interesting when you start to put more than one trigger in place. So what we can do is we can actually put a second one in here, and we'll start to see an interaction between these two trigger points, both moving towards the right from a starting note of D1. So we could get some really interesting things here. So let's just play that on its own. It's almost like a classic sort of prog bass there. I mean, you've probably heard many a progressive house or melodic techno tune start that way. And again, it's there straight away. So again, like, this is almost like a kind of a semi-randomization that's about to start occurring now, because what we can do is start to change that relationship where we've got two of these triggers, in this case, going to the right. What happens if we actually select left and we have one play on the left? So one will move to the left, one will move to the right. So let's see what happens there. And all of a sudden we start getting all kinds of crazy stuff happening. You get the idea. So what happens here, when we've got triggers of opposite directions meeting, we get a redirect. So to, again, play that in isolation, you'll see when they come together on the same cell, there's this redirection. So they'll push each other in opposite directions, or in this case, move themselves up or down the grid. And all of a sudden, I've got something a little bit more complex. Now, what I could also do is find something interesting from here and add a third. Now, one of the things that's really cool about this is I can start from wherever I want here while it's playing. And then if I stop playback, it'll be there. So quite an interesting thing that you can do. So you can kind of iterate on it randomly and have it just cycle and go really into whatever interesting directions you've got here. So of course, we've also got downwards and upwards. So I could always hit an upwards here just to see what happens right from the off and see how that changes the pattern in the interaction. And we can get more complex from there. Let's say if I want to start something here. And in no time, we've got something really groovy, quite interesting, something that, you know, if you laid that out on the piano roll, you'd probably struggle to actually write something like that from the off. So the interactivity of MIDIGriD is quite sensational, to be honest with you. And I've just been really, like, not just pleasantly surprised. It's just absolutely blown me away this week, to be honest with you, legitimately. How simple, how beautiful it is, how elegant and how simplistic it is to use, and how easy it is to get some incredible stuff out of it. And this is just like sort of stage one, really, where we can start to play around with this and we can keep things quite simple and we can kind of add layers in like you've just seen. And also as well, it comes down to being able to do things like being able to control the scale. So as I said before, you can control the scale. You can obviously move it from minor to major and all these different lovely modes like Dorian mode, Phrygian mode, Lydian mode, Mixolydian, straight up minor, and then a Locrian mode as well. So these are always great to play around with because, say, for example, if I'm in D and the root note here is D1, one of the great things I can do straight away is if I decide I want to shift this and say, for example, I want to start on A. Now I'm in A minor and we can start with a completely different element. And what's great about that is that it sounds completely different, but it's exactly the same pattern. That's the wild thing about it. So yeah, man, it's great. Just the flexibility and the ability to modulate this into completely different situations very, very quickly. On a more subtle note, if I was to go back to D and I'm in D minor, I can also change it, as I said, into these modes. So modes are slightly different scales that have slightly different relationships to one another. Again, I could spend the rest of this live stream talking about modes and how they work. But Dorian, just to keep it simple, is if A minor is the white keys on the keyboard from A up to A, and the same as C major in that regard, where it's the white keys on the keyboard from C all the way up to the following C, then D Dorian is quite simply the white keys on the keyboard just starting at D. That's all it is. So again, you'll see this where we've got A sharp 2, A sharp 1. What you'll see here in Dorian, that'll change to B, and that will give you a slightly different tone. So if we start with D minor as we were previously, and then we shift into the Dorian mode, you'll see exactly what I mean. In fact, you won't hear much of a difference there because we've not really hit on that A sharp to B, basically. So what we can do is potentially add something in here so you get a different vibe. So yeah, again, another cell added, another trigger, and it just adds another level of complexity. So really, really quite interesting there. And again, you can add in these other elements as well, such as a redirect. So we could pop a redirect in here on, say, this cell here, and then what will happen is that any trigger or any, movement cell that will hit that redirect will be redirected in another direction. So let's have a little look. In fact, what we'll do is we'll play it and we'll identify an interesting place to put it. I think this A2 here could be quite interesting, so let's see what happens. It's interesting because when you watch the pattern and then you see some of the points at which the different triggers seem to be attracted towards in the way that they move and interact with one another, and then you end up on the A2, it starts to actually create more repeats, which is quite an interesting concept. So the redirects are really smart, really interesting. And again, another thing that's contributing to just how lovely and melodic and kind of groovy this is the swing. So you can add in swing as well. So I like to add in like a 5% swing, and it gives you that lovely sort of almost, Arme style, Innovisions-y sort of like interesting, quite complex, that kind of thing. Again, Arme Reg is a song that I've got in my head right now, which is fairly reminiscent of this kind of thing where, the arps are quite elaborate and quite expressive. And again, you can obviously change the note length. You can change the speed of that as well. A velocity, I've got it just set straight to 127 because I wanted consistency, but you can add in a bit of random variation into the situation here. So each note has slightly different velocity, so you can get a little bit more expressiveness, which is quite cool. And yeah, from here, you can do some really interesting stuff. And you can use Ableton's own, MIDI kind of recording techniques to be able to work with this. So as we mentioned before with MIDIGriD, we've routed the MIDI out of MIDIGriD, and we've taken the MIDI from that channel into Reactor, and the monitor is set to in. Now, if we click the record arm here, one of the things we can do is actually record clips of whatever is being received by that channel. So in this case, it's going to be MIDIGriD. So what we can look at now is that there are a couple of different circumstances where we can actually add in and record and capture the MIDI that's being generated by MIDIGriD, and then we can subject it to further editing using the various tools within Ableton. And that's where, as I say, the rubber really hits the road and it really starts getting interesting. So let's hit record here. We'll get a little bit of a count in, and then you'll see exactly what I mean. And there you go. So you can see not only have we got the original MIDI as it was coming in when the redirect was still in situ, what you may have noticed I did halfway through that sequence of recording is that I removed the redirect, which changed the relationship and therefore gave me a slightly different output. So this means now if I was to fold this, you can see all the different notes that have been triggered. And what's really interesting here is that I can switch on the scale mode, and then I can change this to D and then change it to Dorian. And you can see, obviously, everything is within that scale, which is quite an interesting element. So from here, I've got all sorts of different opportunities. Now, one thing to note here, Monarch is a monophonic synth, which, again, a lot of bass synths tend to be. So in this case, we've got some repeated notes here. We've got some like layered stuff going on in certain capacities here. So what I would be tending to do is remove those notes. But what I've also got the ability to do here is to take a little bit more command of the pattern by being able to work within this scale mode, because I know I'm working within D Dorian, and be able to, again, collapse or fold the piano roll down into D Dorian, which means if I don't like the fact that there's a repeating note here, what I could do is work on a couple of these bars and hit a bit of a loop. And what I'm going to do here is I'm going to flip the monitor. I don't need to do anything to MIDIGriD. I'm just flipping the monitor over to auto. auto off in this case, and then it'll play what we are seeing within that MIDI clip. So if I play that on its own, I can even turn off MIDIGRiD for a second, and you'll see what I mean. You've got that little bum, so you might want to actually pop that up. Change some of the timings. Maybe add another note in. And again, using MIDIGRiD as the basis for being able to compose this pattern and come up with it in a generative way right from the off just gives you a kicking off point, essentially. So again, with all the tools that are arriving now, especially the tools that ADSR are creating at the moment, the likes of MIDIGRiD, the likes of Hexel, for example, you don't really need to start with a blank canvas. One of the great things that has really challenged, music producers and electronic music producers over the years is opening your DAW up and looking at the blank screen going, well, I don't even know where to start, really. And nowadays, it's never been easier to gain a little bit of inspiration from the off by using these plugins that add a little bit of randomization, which allows you to jump off and be able to get inspired and be able to, work from there. So it's a very, very cool thing indeed. So obviously with some of the other MIDI tools, what I could do here is I could say, for example, if I don't like or I want a variation, there's a couple of things I can do here. So I can select everything here. And again, this is just Ableton MIDI advanced tips here for a second. You can reverse that. Or the other idea is you can invert. Some interesting ideas there. And again, we could reverse these two. Maybe bring them down an octave, shift down. And all of a sudden, this is a quite interesting, quite nasty bass line that would work quite well in progressive house or melodic techno, for example. So yeah, again, we've used MIDIGRiD as the jumping off point, which I think is absolutely beautiful. So again, where bass is concerned, we've got that as a really nice solid starting point. Now, the other way you can do this, because the way that I've done this is the longer way around. However, it does allow you to be more expressive because it's going to capture the MIDI in real time as it's being played. Hence why when I removed the redirect trigger from that A2 cell at the top, it changed the capture, it changed the output, so therefore it changed the MIDI that was being recorded. Now, the other way you can do it is you can set the length here with the 3 dots at the top corner of MIDIGRiD, and you can set whether or not you want it for 4 bars, 1 bar, 16 bars. You've got the whole, the whole length of it there. So we'll go for 4 bars, and you can see this little kind of, compass icon here, if you will. And what that means is that I can just drag the MIDI straight in, and then it gives me that solid readout of whatever it is that MIDIGRiD is doing in a 4-bar loop, which is quite cool. Again, we could change that and go to 8 bars, and then we can drop that in and you can see there's a little bit more randomization. And again, if we want to get really interesting and really expressive, we can throw it out to 16 bars, and it's basically going to throw out, the whole remit of what MIDIGriD would do over that period. So again, very, very quick, very simple to get really elaborate passages going, which is quite a cool thing. And again, you've got all these lovely presets as well, and we're going to look at some of the presets in a moment. What I am going to do is I'm actually going to go back to user, and I'm going to just put this simple bass back in play, and that's what we'll use for the moment, for the time being. So we'll stop playback on that. I'm just going to hit 0 on both of these to make sure they're deactivated. And we're going to go back to our nice basic bass because it works quite well with the ARP.